As soon as this photo was released to the public, people went crazy. It was a big deal.
They are not just photographs. They are evidence of moments humanity should never have captured. Each image freezes the exact second when life ended, when horror unfolded, or when cruelty was considered normal. These are the photos that were never meant to be seen again.
This photo, in and of itself, in its original state, was tremendous.
From death written in a miner's final note to the blindfolded Polish prisoners walking toward execution, every picture tells a story too disturbing to forget and too real to ever look at without feeling dread. The Tenerife airport disaster, the day the sky turned into fire. It began with a terrorist bomb. On March 27, 1977, an explosion at Gran Canaria Airport in Spain forced dozens of international flights to be diverted to a small, fog-covered airport on Tenerife Island. The Los Rodeos runway was never meant to hold that much traffic. Planes were jammed wing to wing, taxiways were blocked, and the radio frequencies were crowded with overlapping voices. What began as an act of terror far away set in motion the deadliest aviation disaster the world has ever seen. Among the stranded aircraft were two giants of the sky, KLM Flight 4805 and Pan Am Flight 1736, both Boeing 747s carrying hundreds of passengers. The KLM plane was commanded by Captain Jacob Van Zanten, one of the airline's most admired pilots and even the face of their safety advertisements. But that day, he was exhausted, frustrated, and under pressure. He had been waiting for hours, and his crew was growing restless. The Pan Am pilots, meanwhile, were still taxiing on the same runway, confused by poor instructions and almost zero visibility. The fog was so thick that even the control tower could not see the planes. Inside the KLM cockpit, Van Zanten made a fatal choice. Believing he had clearance to take off, he said, "We're going." His co-pilot hesitated, uncertain, but the engines roared to life. As the massive aircraft began to roll, the Pan Am crew heard the thunder of engines through the fog. "There he is!" someone shouted. The Pan Am captain tried to turn off the runway, but the jet was too large and too slow. The KLM plane broke through the fog like a monster. Its lights appeared for only a second before the collision. The front landing gear struck the Pan Am fuselage, tearing off the roof. Fire burst from both planes as fuel tanks exploded. The sound was deafening. Inside the cabins, people screamed and clung to one another while the floor melted beneath them. Those in the KLM plane never stood a chance. In seconds, it became a furnace. When rescuers finally reached the scene, they found the runway littered with bodies and burning wreckage. The air smelled of smoke, fuel, and death. 583 people were gone because of a chain of human impatience, confusion, and one terrorist act that began hundreds of miles away. The photograph of that day shows nothing but ruin, yet behind it lies a story of pressure, miscommunication, and a single decision that turned the sky into fire. The starving girl who stared back. The photograph was taken in April 1945, just days after American troops liberated the Dachau concentration camp in Germany. It showed an 18-year-old Russian girl standing among piles of corpses. The bodies around her were fellow prisoners, men, women, and children who had starved to death, been executed, or died from disease in the last weeks before liberation. Dachau had been one of the first Nazi camps ever built, and by the end of the war, it had become a place of unimaginable suffering. When Allied soldiers arrived, they found over 30,000 survivors and more than 10,000 bodies left to rot. In the image, the girl stood barefoot in rags. Her face was gray, her arms nothing but bone, and her eyes were so wide that they seemed to stare through the camera. She had survived months of starvation, slave labor, and fear. Every day she had watched people collapse beside her, their bodies dragged away or left where they fell. She was not crying when the photograph was taken. She was beyond tears. The soldiers who entered the camp said the stench was overwhelming, a mix of decay, sweat, and smoke from the crematorium. The girl's expression captured the moment between death and freedom. She was alive, but only barely. When she looked into the camera, it was not a look of gratitude. It was disbelief. She had seen too much to understand rescue. The photograph remains one of the most haunting images of the Holocaust because it shows not a victim in death, but someone forced to keep living. Her hollow stare told the story of starvation, cruelty, and survival in its rawest form. In her eyes, history could see what words could never explain, the face of a life that had survived hell. The coal miner's final note. The Freighterville mine disaster of 1902 was one of the most horrifying industrial tragedies in American history. Deep beneath the hills of Tennessee, an explosion tore through the Freighterville coal mine, trapping more than 200 men. The blast came without warning. Methane gas had built up inside the shafts, and when a miner's lamp sparked, the tunnels filled with flame and toxic smoke. Some men were killed instantly. Others survived the blast but were sealed off by collapsed rock and poisonous air. Among them was miner Jacob Vowell. In near total darkness, he realized that escape was impossible. He could hear his co-workers coughing, gasping, and praying. One by one, the voices went silent as oxygen disappeared. Jacob tore a scrap of paper from his lunch pail and began to write a note to his wife, Ellen, and their 6 children. His words were shaky, but clear at first. "We are shut in," he wrote. "No hope for us all. I see heaven. Tell all the boys I love them." As the air thinned, his handwriting weakened, each letter smaller and fainter. Near the end, his pencil barely left marks on the page. When rescuers finally reached the chamber 7 days later, they found Jacob slumped beside 10 other men, the note still clutched in his hand. It had been preserved by the damp air and coal dust. His final words read, "It is 2:30 o'clock. We are still alive. Oh God, for one more breath. Goodbye, Ellen. Goodbye, children." The photograph of that note remains one of the most disturbing artifacts of human tragedy. Every fading line on that paper carried the sound of a dying breath and the love of a father who refused to die without saying goodbye. The Moundsville air disaster. The photograph from July 10, 1921, looks like a war zone, but it was taken at a small air show in Moundsville, West Virginia. The image shows mangled cars, thick smoke, and pieces of a plane scattered across a field. What could not be photographed was the sound, the screams of families burned alive. It was supposed to be a joyful event where people gathered to watch one of the new marvels of the age, the Martin MB-1 bomber, perform a low pass over the crowd. In seconds, excitement turned into horror. The pilot had lost control during a demonstration flight. As he tried to climb too sharply, the plane's engine stalled. The aircraft dropped straight into the spectators below, slamming into parked cars filled with families. The impact caused an instant explosion. Fuel sprayed over people, and the heat was so intense that it melted car frames and trapped anyone who had not already fled. The pilot and his co-pilot were thrown clear of the aircraft by the force of the impact, landing several yards away from the burning wreck. Both men were badly injured, with broken bones and severe burns, but they survived because they were thrown out before the flames engulfed the cockpit. Dazed and bleeding, they crawled across the ground as the fire spread behind them, listening to the screams of the crowd they could no longer save. The people on the ground were not as lucky. 5 bystanders died instantly, and 14 more suffered burns so severe that doctors later said they could smell the flesh before they reached the site. The photograph shows the wreckage smoking among blackened cars. The ground is littered with debris, charred belongings, and twisted metal. Men stand in shock while others try to pull bodies from the flames. Women are seen fainting, and children cry for parents who never moved again. The fire burned for hours before it was brought under control. The girl who fell from the sky. On Christmas Eve, 1971, a Lanza Flight 508 from Lima to Pucallpa, Peru, broke apart in midair after being struck by lightning. The plane carried 92 people. Only one survived, 17-year-old Julianne Kopcke. The photograph taken after her rescue showed her sitting on a log in the Amazon rainforest, covered in dirt, insect bites, and deep bruises. Her face looked blank, her eyes wide with shock. She was alive, but she did not look human anymore. When the lightning hit, Julianne had been sitting next to her mother. The explosion tore the fuselage apart, and she was thrown out, still strapped to her seat. She fell more than 2 miles through the air, spinning helplessly before crashing into the jungle canopy. The trees broke her fall, but she landed hard, breaking her collarbone and tearing open her right arm. When she woke up, the forest was silent, except for insects. Her first thought was that her mother might still be alive. For days, she searched the wreckage, following the smell of burned fuel and decaying bodies. She found parts of the plane scattered across the jungle. At one point, she came across 3 passengers still strapped to their seats, buried headfirst in the ground. Among them was her mother. Julianne later said she touched her mother's body but could not cry. She knew she had to keep moving or die. She followed a small creek for 11 days, drinking dirty water and fending off swarms of mosquitoes. Maggots crawled in her wounds. She could barely walk by the time she stumbled upon a group of loggers who carried her to safety. The photograph taken after her rescue is disturbing because it shows not victory, but trauma. She had seen what no one should ever see and lived to remember every moment of it. The father and his dead infant. This photograph, taken in Sweden in 1921, captured a scene that still shocks anyone who sees it. A father sat beside the body of his baby girl, who had lived for only 28 days. The little girl had been born weak, struggling to breathe from the moment she entered the world. The doctor had called it a lung infection, most likely pneumonia, which was often fatal for infants at that time. There were no antibiotics, no proper hospitals nearby, and only rough homemade remedies. For days, the parents had watched her chest rise and fall in shallow gasps until one night it stopped. A week before that, the baby's mother had died from what was described as childbed fever, an infection that spread through her body after giving birth. It was common in the early 1900s when medical care for women was limited and sanitation was poor. The fever started with chills and pain, then turned into violent shaking and delirium. She had died in the same bed where she had given birth, leaving her husband alone with a newborn he had no idea how to care for. When the baby died days later, neighbors helped arrange the funeral and convinced him to take a photograph before burial. It was meant to serve as remembrance, but the picture captured something far darker. The baby lay on a white cloth, her face calm, her tiny hands folded. Her father sat stiff beside her. His eyes were red and his body slumped as if he had nothing left to hold himself up. The image reveals the cost of early 20th century life when childbirth and sickness could wipe out a family in a single week. Polish prisoners led to execution, the march no one returned from. The photograph from the Pomeranian forest in late 1939 showed the exact moment before death. A line of Polish prisoners, blindfolded and stumbling, walked through the trees surrounded by armed SS soldiers. The men in the picture were civilians, teachers, priests, doctors, and community leaders rounded up during the first months of the German occupation of Poland. They had been told they were being relocated, but they knew the truth the moment they heard the forest go silent. The ground beneath them was already soaked with blood from earlier executions. This photograph captured what came to be known as part of the Intelligence Action, a Nazi campaign to eliminate Poland's educated class and leadership. Tens of thousands were arrested, tortured, and shot across Poland in 1939 and 1940. The victims were often forced to dig their own graves. The victims' hands are often tied, and their faces were covered with cloth so they would not see the rifles aimed at them. Behind them, SS soldiers appeared calm and efficient, carrying out orders as if it were routine work. They smoked, talked quietly, and waited for the command. The haunting power of the photo came from what it did not show: the next few seconds. There would be no trial, no record of names, only unmarked graves covered with pine needles. The Nazis tried to hide these killings, but photographs like this one survived, exposing the cold system of murder that began the war's darkest chapter. The Titanic victims' shoes. Beneath 2 miles of dark ocean, a single pair of shoes lay side by side on the seabed. They once belonged to a passenger of the RMS Titanic, the ship that sank on April 15, 1912, killing more than 1,500 people. The body that once filled them had long since decayed, leaving only the shoes as proof that someone had died there. The photo taken by deep-sea explorers shows no skeleton, no clothing, just the shoes resting in the exact position where the person's body settled before the ocean took everything else. The sight is horrifying because it feels human. You can imagine the person who wore them, standing on the deck as the ship went down, screaming in the freezing air, then sinking into silence. Every inch of the image reminds us that this was once a person, someone who had a family, hopes, and fear in their final minutes. Hiroshima aftermath. At exactly 8:15 a.m. on August 6, 1945, the first atomic bomb ever used in war exploded over Hiroshima, Japan. In less than 1 second, a city of more than 300,000 people turned into dust and fire. The explosion released heat hotter than the surface of the sun. Thousands of men, women, and children standing in the open were instantly vaporized. Their bodies left nothing behind but faint outlines on stone walls and pavements. These became known as atomic shadows. Everything they had been, clothes, faces, movement, vanished, leaving only a human shape burned into concrete. The blast destroyed nearly 5 square miles of the city. Wooden houses burst into flames. Streetcars melted. Rivers boiled. Those not killed instantly staggered through the ruins with skin hanging from their arms, blinded by the flash, crying for water that would only worsen their burns. Hospitals were destroyed, and doctors who survived had no tools or medicine to treat anyone. People tried to help children trapped under fallen beams, but the fires were spreading too fast. The photograph taken in the aftermath showed nothing recognizable as a city. There were no buildings, no streets, and no sound. Only scorched earth and skeletal ruins. In the center of the image, the shadow of a man remained imprinted on a set of stone steps, the only proof that he had ever existed. The photo is disturbing because it revealed not just destruction, but the beginning of a new kind of horror. It showed that one weapon could erase an entire population in seconds. Survivors described Hiroshima afterward as a living graveyard. The Titanic musician's final performance. When the RMS Titanic struck an iceberg on April 14, 1912, panic spread across the decks. Passengers screamed, crewmen shouted orders, and lifeboats began to lower into the freezing Atlantic. Amid the chaos, a small group of men walked calmly onto the deck carrying their instruments. They were the ship's orchestra, led by bandmaster Wallace Hartley. Their orders were not from the captain. They played by choice. The photograph associated with this moment, taken before the voyage, showed 8 men in uniform, with violins, cellos, and a piano. When people see that picture now, they know that every man in it would be dead within hours. Witnesses later told how, as the ship tilted and the cold wind cut through the air, the musicians began to play light, cheerful tunes to calm the passengers. The sound drifted across the deck while lifeboats filled and people fought for space. Survivors remembered hearing waltzes, ragtime, and hymns echoing between the screams. As the bow sank lower, the deck slanted sharply. Water flooded the band's platform, yet they did not stop. Their final song was believed to be "Nearer, My God, to Thee." People clung to railings and wept as the music continued until the lights went out. Minutes later, the icy water swept over them. The orchestra members froze and sank with the ship, their instruments still strapped to their bodies. Days later, rescuers found Wallace Hartley's violin case floating among debris. The image of those men playing as death surrounded them remains one of the most haunting scenes in history. It showed the calmest courage inside the most terrifying disaster. Their music did not save anyone, but it gave dying people one last moment of peace before the sea swallowed them all. The Human Zoo at Coney Island. In 1905, visitors to Coney Island's Luna Park in New York gathered not for a ride or a show, but to stare at people. Behind a wooden fence and iron bars sat a group of Filipino men, women, and children brought from the Philippines to be displayed as living exhibits. Among them was a young Filipino girl, no older than 10, sitting on the ground with her hands folded in her lap. The photograph taken that day showed her staring out through the bars, surrounded by spectators laughing and pointing. She was not an actor or a performer. She was part of a human zoo. At the time, the Philippines had recently been colonized by the United States after the Spanish-American War. American organizers claimed the display was educational, meant to show the public how primitive people lived. In reality, it was a cruel form of exploitation and humiliation. The Filipinos were forced to live in mock villages, built from straw and bamboo. They were told to cook, dance, and dress in loincloths, while well-dressed American families watched them as if they were animals. The young girl in the photo appeared confused and frightened. Her eyes looked straight into the camera, and her expression revealed that she understood what was happening. Around her, crowds of men in suits and women in fancy hats leaned forward to take pictures. They smiled while she remained silent. She was far from home, treated as an object rather than a child. The photo remains a painful reminder of an era when human beings were displayed like curiosities, a time when cruelty was normalized and empathy was locked outside the fence. Frozen Soviet soldiers. The photograph from the Winter War in 1940 showed 2 Soviet soldiers sitting in their foxhole, completely frozen. Their bodies were locked in the exact positions they had been in when they died. One still held his rifle. The other's hand was raised slightly, as if about to speak. Their faces were pale blue and covered in frost, their eyes half open. At first glance, they looked alive, as if they had simply stopped moving. But they were dead, preserved by the brutal cold of the Finnish front. The Winter War was fought between the Soviet Union and Finland after the Soviets invaded in November 1939. The fighting took place in one of the harshest winters ever recorded. Temperatures dropped to nearly -40 degrees Celsius. Many Soviet troops had been sent in without proper winter gear. They were young, inexperienced, and poorly equipped. When Finnish snipers and ambushes struck, there was often no chance to retreat. Those who were not shot died slowly from exposure. The photo was taken after a Finnish patrol discovered the frozen soldiers days later. The men had died in the middle of combat, and the freezing wind had turned them into statues. The scene was so eerie that Finnish soldiers hesitated to approach, believing for a moment that the two might still be alive. Heath Ledger's final photograph. In January 2008, actor Heath Ledger was photographed walking alone through a cold London street. He wore a dark coat. His shoulders were hunched and his eyes were hidden behind sunglasses, even though the sky was gray. At first glance, it looked like an ordinary candid shot of a celebrity between projects. But soon after, that photograph became something else, the last image of him alive. Ledger had been in London filming the Imaginarium of Dr. Parnassus. Friends said he had been struggling with exhaustion and insomnia. He was taking prescription medications to help him sleep, but the combination was dangerous. Those close to him noticed he had grown quiet, withdrawn, and pale. In the photo, his face looked gaunt, his beard uneven, and his expression blank. He seemed lost in his own thoughts, disconnected from everything around him. Behind the image lay months of intense work and emotional strain. Just a year earlier, Ledger had finished filming The Dark Knight, where he played the Joker, a role that consumed him mentally and physically. He told interviewers that he could only sleep a few hours each night and that the character's darkness followed him off the set. The exhaustion showed. His posture in the photo was heavy, his steps slow, as if every movement took effort. Weeks later, he was found dead in his New York apartment from an accidental overdose of sleeping pills, painkillers, and anti-anxiety drugs. The Great Molasses Flood. On the afternoon of January 15, 1919, the streets of Boston's North End turned into a nightmare. Without warning, a massive steel storage tank holding over 2 million gallons of molasses burst open. The explosion sent a dark, sticky wave through the streets at nearly 35 miles per hour. It rose as high as 15 feet and swept away everything in its path: people, horses, wagons, and entire buildings. The photograph taken later showed quiet, glistening streets coated in thick syrup, but it hid the screams and horror that had filled those same streets minutes earlier. The tank had been poorly built and never properly tested. Workers had noticed leaks for months, but the company ignored them. When the steel walls finally split, the sound was like a cannon firing. A wave of boiling hot molasses slammed through the neighborhood, crushing houses and trapping anyone too slow to run. 21 people died, and more than 150 were injured. Many suffocated because they could not move through the thick syrup. Horses fought to escape, but sank and drowned. Their bodies were found days later, hardened in the sugar as the liquid cooled. The image that remains from that day is disturbing because of its stillness. It shows empty streets, twisted steel, and pools of hardened molasses that look harmless, but cover bodies underneath. Rescuers struggled to free victims for days, cutting through the hardened sludge that had turned solid overnight. The Great Molasses Flood remains one of the strangest and most haunting industrial disasters in history. What do you think about these incidents? Which of them struck you the most? Comment down below.